Okay, we're going to get started now. So hello, everyone. And for those of you who just joined in, welcome. This is a webinar, What Makes Nonviolent Movements Succeed, an interview with Dr. Erica Chenoweth, hosted by Momentum. My name is Alexandra Flores-Quilty. I'm an organizer and a lead trainer with Momentum. And I am so honored and excited to be on the phone with Dr. Erica Chenoweth, whose work I have long admired and also studied quite a bit. We're really, really excited for this interview. And I'm going to pass it over to Leo, who's going to be co-hosting this webinar with me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leo Liu. I'm here today as a volunteer with Momentum and one of your two hosts and interviewers. Recently, as a volunteer with Momentum, I helped facilitate a 3-day Momentum training that happened in New York City. I also feel really excited to be joining everybody who's here right now. One thing kind of by ways of an introduction that I wanted to share is that I feel really lucky and privileged to have actually taken a class with Erica, and actually I've worked as her research assistant too back in 2011. So I'm excited for lots of things, but one of those is to reconnect and learn a little bit more about Erica's research. Erica, we're going to give you plenty of time to share a little bit more about yourself once the interview starts, but in the meantime, do you want to give people a quick introduction so people know who you are?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Erica Chenoweth. I am a political scientist, and I teach at the University of Denver in Colorado in the United States. My research is mostly on nonviolent civil resistance, where and why it happens, how it succeeds or fails, and why, and then what the long-term impacts of nonviolent civil resistance are. I also study political violence by both non-state actors like rebel groups or terror groups and by governments against their own populations to try to better understand when, how, and why repression happens and how it can be stopped.
Thank you, Erica. We're really looking forward to hearing you sharing more about yourself and your work in a little bit. And also really excited to be joined by so many people who've tuned in for the webinar, many people from the Momentum community. Erica's work has been really central to the Momentum curriculum. Momentum is both a training program and a community of practice. We have a training program that offers an understanding for how social change happens and a model of movement building. And also it's a community of practice where organizers and activists experiment in building social movements with strategic nonviolent action to move public opinion and win change. And our community and our theory owes a great debt to researchers like you, Erica. Your research is a big part of our curriculum and has underscored for us the crucial importance of mass, diverse participation for successful grassroots campaigns around the world. So we're very excited to have Erica and some of the Momentum community here with us today.
I couldn't agree more. I also wanted to say, so I don't believe that Momentum has done a webinar like this before. So just for all the people who are listeners, we're all new and in this together. I wanted to quickly just articulate and share some of the goals that we have out of this interview. So first, we are excited to build connections between the Momentum community of organizers and trainers and facilitators with Erica, who does such incredible and important research for our community, which I hope I hope she knows that now. Number two, we wanted to just elevate kind of the specific contributions of Erica's work for much of the work that we do as practitioners of nonviolent resistance or movement builders or community organizers. And finally, near to the end of the call, we just want to give folks on this call an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about Erica's work as it might pertain to work that you're doing, kind of either nonviolent organizing that is kind of momentum based or really otherwise. So yeah, those are some of the goals. And now let me turn things over to Lissy, who's going to give us kind of a basic orientation to Zoom, the platform that we're on.
Great, thanks, Leo. Hey everybody, my name is Lissy. I'm staff with Momentum. Super excited you all are here. We'll spend the next 35 minutes just listening in as AFQ, as Alexandra or AFQ and Leo interview Erica. And then After that, we'll have 10 or 15 minutes to take questions from you all and put them to Erica now. The questions that we're asking over the next 35 minutes were collected over the past couple of weeks from folks in the community, but I'm sure that you'll have new questions come up as we listen in. So if you'd like to share a question, I will be collecting them and then sharing them afterward. We'll have time probably for 2 or 3, but I encourage you to post your questions in the chat box. And if you are wondering how to chat still, you can look at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a little button that says chat. Click on that and a sidebar should pop up where you can type your name, where you're coming from, and one thing you're excited about with this interview. And then I will collect all the questions over the next 35 minutes and be delighted to share a couple of them before we close the interview.
Great. Thank you so much, Lissy. And great. Well, let's just dig in. By the way, my name's Alexandra, but Momentum people often call me AFQ. It's not an organization. It's just my nickname. So let's go ahead and dig in. I'm super excited. Let's start with a little introduction to your work, Erica. For those of us who may be tuning in who might be unfamiliar with your work, it'd be great if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, your research on nonviolent civil resistance, and how you came to be interested in civil resistance to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Yeah, so I first came to this topic about 12 years ago. I was attending a workshop called People, Power, and Pedagogy that was put on by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. That's an educational foundation in Washington, D.C. That aims to spread knowledge about the theory and practice of civil resistance. And at the time, I was a PhD student in political science, really interested in applying different quantitative and statistical techniques to questions about how to reduce violence more generally. But I was not at all familiar with civil resistance or any of the literature related to that topic. And so when I went to the workshop, there were a lot of kind of cases being discussed, like the Philippines or Serbia, and other examples where people power movements had been successful in either toppling entrenched power or engaging in different types of mass action that led to successful territorial independence through anti-colonial action or secession. And I was still kind of bothered by a few key questions. One was whether nonviolent resistance could succeed in incredibly difficult circumstances where, say, the opponent government was willing to use massive military force against unarmed demonstrators. The second question was whether it was possible that in cases where nonviolent resistance worked, it was simply because it was easier in general to mobilize collective action in those types of settings. And then I was also wondering whether nonviolent resistance could work when one's goals were really extreme or radical. I thought maybe it only worked when people's goals were kind of reformist or kind of incremental or moderate. So Maria Stephan, who also was at the workshop, which I see someone's asking the name of the institution. It's the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. They have a great website, and I think one of their employees is here on the chat as well, Steve Chase. So anyway, Maria Stephan and I met there, and we were able to kind of argue a little bit about these kind of reservations about whether civil resistance could be effective. And you know, Maria was sort of saying, well, if you think that it isn't effective, how would you actually demonstrate that? And so she and I kind of came up with a research design that I thought met most of my concerns. And the research design was to collect data from every country in the world from 1900 onward that had experienced some kind of mass mobilization, violent or nonviolent or somewhere in between, for maximalist goals, so the overthrow of a dictatorship or territorial independence. And I thought we needed to apply a very strict measure of whether those campaigns succeeded or failed. So they had to have achieved all of those maximalist goals, that is the overthrow of a dictator through extra institutional means, or territorial independence. And they had to have done that within a year of the peak of their mobilization. and they had to have had a decided effect on that outcome. So in other words, if a dictator dies in office of a heart attack, it doesn't count as a success, even though you can make the indirect claim that the movement might have stressed out the dictator and been an indirect cause of the heart attack. So ultimately, once we had these data collected, we had 323 cases of mass mobilization where people were using either nonviolent methods, where unarmed civilians were confronting the opponents actively using protests, boycotts, strikes, stayaways, and other methods of action that didn't directly harm or threaten to directly harm the opponent, or armed action, so where people are armed and they're using different forms of guerrilla attacks, hit and run, assassination campaigns, and the like in order to achieve their goals. And it turns out that once we do that comparison, that the nonviolent campaigns were some twice as likely to succeed as their violent counterparts. And they were also twice as likely to achieve significant concessions short of full success, like forcing competitive elections or significant territorial autonomy. Another very striking finding from this study was that this was true even in cases where the opponent was very brutal and repressive, using lethal repression against the movements, or where the movement was operating in an authoritarian regime, where the country was very poor, where the state had extensive military power. And this was true across regions of the world. So there didn't seem to be places in the world where nonviolent resistance wasn't a thing. It seemed to be almost a universal thing, which was surprising as well. And then a third really important and striking finding was that the effects of the manner of struggle persist long after the campaign is over. So for example, in countries where there had been mass mobilization of a nonviolent kind, these countries were far more likely to emerge from the conflict as democratic countries. They were far more likely to enjoy periods of relative peace in the aftermath. And many other studies after this have shown that there are other kind of longer term benefits, like greater respect for human rights, greater quality of life or standard of living measured in various ways, and so forth. And this is in stark contrast to the so-called conflict trap, which many countries that experience civil war tend to be drawn into. And it's a multi-generational process to emerge out of violent civil conflict with functional infrastructure, legitimate government, and relative improvements in quality of life. So in other words, nonviolent resistance works both in the short term to elicit strategic victories, but it also works in the longer term to improve standard of living and quality of life for people that reside in these countries that are affected by conflict. So that's kind of the primary finding, I think, that that this research is known for, and the book Why Civil Resistance Works that Maria and I put together. That book came out in 2011, and since then I've done a great deal of research on all kinds of other dimensions of civil resistance, which I'm sure we'll get into shortly.
Great, and I have my handy dandy copy of the book here that I carry around with me often. So I highly recommend it to folks. For people who might be still getting to know your work, maybe it'd be helpful to share maybe some like the most common misconceptions that you get with your research and the research that came out with your book.
Sure. So the first most common misconception is that nonviolent civil resistance is a moral position. Now, it is definitely the case that many people who use nonviolent resistance are using it because they think it's morally sound and that it's morally justified. And it's definitely the case that a lot of people who live a life of nonviolence live according to certain spiritual principles that prescribe the use of violence without necessarily engaging in civil resistance as a method of pursuing political and social change. And so nonviolent resistance, as I'm using it here, is more just something that we can observe as a thing that exists in the world. It's when people use a series of methods that are nonviolent in order to actively confront an oppressive opponent and try to bring about social change. And so it's not necessarily something that wins because people decide that the movement is more righteous or moral. Nonviolent resistance doesn't work because it melts the hearts of dictators, for example. It tends to work because it constrains the options of dictators. It constrains the options of the oppressor through building massive support from below and then starting to disrupt the pillars of support upon whose power those opponents rely. I think another major misconception is that when we say nonviolent resistance, we mean mass demonstrations. Mass demonstrations are one of many thousands of techniques of nonviolent struggle. And in fact, I would argue that most movements that only stick to mass demonstrations tend not to win in the end. So nonviolent resistance is a category of struggle, not necessarily one technique, one method of struggle. And then the third misconception I would say is that nonviolent resistance is something that, you know, is something that happens almost spontaneously, or that, you know, people kind of flood into the streets and gain some kind of political momentum, and everybody's sort of overcome by events, and the outcomes are totally unpredictable and so forth. And in fact, many of the campaigns that I've studied were actually very well organized, and organization is a critical factor in determining whether these campaigns have the staying power that they need in order to survive escalation of repression and the various setbacks that come to pass over the course of a broad-based movement. I think the other thing is just more broadly the sense that you know, there are structural conditions or circumstances that make nonviolent resistance impossible. Now, if those exist, I haven't found them yet, and I've been trying to find them for the past 12 years. But it seems like in every kind of system of government and every kind of economic order that we've had, at least over the past 118 years, people have figured out a way to use their people power to challenge or confront those systems. And of course, some succeed and some fail, but in almost all cases that I can imagine, they had a better shot at success than using armed struggle as an alternative to confront those opponents.
Oh, sorry about that. I think I was muted. Thank you so much, Erica. It's funny that you end on that, because I think it's a really perfect segue to the next question that I wanted to ask. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and move on from kind of the content of your research, which is really rich, and I would love to dig into that even more, but also sort of bring in focus kind of some of the practical applications and kind of the challenges of the momentum community, things that we're especially interested in. So you mentioned just right now that in your book with Dr. Maria Stephan, Why Civil Resistance Works, that the cases that you focused on were these maximalist political goal cases, overthrowing autocrats, gaining independence, achieving territorial secession, and that the research doesn't focus on perhaps maybe some of the easier cases, or at least cases that are different, such as like domestic policy goals. A lot of the social movements and organizers in our community, I think, work primarily kind of in that space. It's like US-based domestic policy goal kind of organizing. And I know it's kind of funny to ask about like what do you know about these campaigns for which you didn't necessarily collect a lot of data. And I know that also partly because I was on your data collection team for one of the stages of the research. But nonetheless, I'm curious from your perspective, kind of like what insights or any insights you think that your research or the research of other civil resistance scholars may have to offer groups like those in the momentum community who might be doing strategic nonviolent resistance or actions that may take place in countries like the US, so kind of like liberal democracies, or that may have kind of domestic policy goals like immigrant rights or racial justice or any of the number of things that we hear about kind of in the news all of the time.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And The good news about the limited nature of our study vis-a-vis the sample or the data that we analyzed is that it was doable, which is to say, by limiting the nature of the campaigns we studied, we could actually collect those data and do an analysis. Whereas if we were trying to do like any kind of movement in any country in the world, I'd still be coding those data, and I would need a few more tens of millions of dollars in order to support the data collection of that with research assistance. Because as you know, there's just so many things to count and to keep track of. But the other thing that's good news about it is because we did use maximalist campaigns, that is campaigns that were trying to bring forth truly radical transformation to the nature of their political systems, a lot of the insights that come from those very difficult cases may more easily apply in democratic settings, right? So let me just walk through the 4 things that come out from those data as being the most important things in explaining whether those campaigns win. And we can kind of intuit whether they map onto a democratic setting. So the first is very large and diverse participation. So this is a critical factor because it influences all the others. The more people a movement can get, the more likely it is to succeed, particularly when the people who are actively involved represent a very cross-cutting group of people in the society that is cutting across race, class, ethnicity, political ideology, and the like. The reason mass participation matters so much is because it then allows movements to tap into different relationships that exist among those participants in ways that can disrupt and sway the different pillars of support that are propping up the system we're fighting, right? So if it's a fight against some kind of policy, say in the United States, we can map out which actors or which groups in society are benefiting from that policy, which groups in society are supporting it actively, and which groups are necessary for it to continue. And then in doing so, we can map out, like basically who we need to get and in terms of participation to start to pull those pillars away from that policy and sort of provide them with a clear alternative, contest their own interests in continuing to support it, or otherwise just make it so that it's too costly for them to continue supporting the policy because it becomes too disruptive and it's against their interests. The third thing that movements do in these maximalist contexts is they tend to mix up their methods a lot. So I mentioned already that when people just rely on something like protests or mass demonstrations uniformly, they tend not to succeed because it becomes very predictable, easy to maneuver around, and then over the long haul, much more susceptible to repression. And so movements that succeed tend to innovate tactics constantly. And they tend to do so in a way that allows them to continue staying one step ahead, where they're taking the initiative or staying on the offensive, rather than kind of constantly reacting to what the opponent's next move is. And then the third thing they tend to do is they tend to be able to stay they tend to be able to stay put. That is to say, they maintain resilience even when repression starts to increase against them, or when they suffer setbacks. And this is kind of linked to 2 things. One is that they tend not to become indisciplined or disunited when things get difficult. But the other thing is that they tend to be able to absorb losses and setbacks and continue on with a broader plan because they're either well organized or they've thought through a whole strategy that they can lose a battle and still win the war. So in that sense, those are kind of the 4 elements that we found make movement successful. And if you imagine, okay, that those are in maximalist cases, it makes sense that those same principles generally could apply to movements domestically, even if they have quite limited targets or outcomes that they're seeking. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean that I think these general principles apply. I've done a little bit of research on things like anti-corporate mobilization with my colleague Tricia Olson, and we found actually remarkably similar results to maximalist cases. So, the number of people, sort of the thresholds of people required to make multinational corporations in developing countries change their behavior is very similar to the proportion of people required, for example, to overthrow a dictator in a society. It's very interesting. There's also a lot of studies on things like strikes in Western Europe, protests in France against different labor action, or for different labor actions against different companies and the government. And all of these similarly find that, for the similar reasons, the sort of expansion of participation bases, the ability to elicit the support of third parties, to pull the pillars of support away from the opponent, to maintain resilience, all of these come as very common kind of features of successful campaigns. So, I think until we're proven wrong, I don't know that there's a ton of reason to believe that these same principles wouldn't apply in democratic settings.
Thank you so much. And kind of building off that same point, I'm curious if there are like particular examples of strategic nonviolent campaigns that you have studied. Maybe it's the multinational corporate, or maybe some of the stuff in France that you feel like might map onto kind of the U.S. particularly well. Maybe, I mean, like it's such an anomalous place in so many ways, but basically, I'm wondering if they're kind of like case studies or places where you feel like organizers, like momentum organizers, might be able to draw from maybe more than kind of the average case because of similarities with the pillars of support and some of the dynamics of where we are.
Mm-hmm. Good question. So in the U.S. in particular, I think there are a couple interesting cases. I mean, honestly, the best place to study, the best place to use as an analogy for contemporary United States is historical United States. It's much smarter than trying to import, cases from elsewhere that have lots of different historical and cultural peculiarities. I would say, like, the United States has such a ripe history of movement activity since before it was even a country. Some of you may be familiar with Walter Conser's work on understanding the American Revolution as basically a civil resistance campaign. Because if you think about the 10 years before the first shots at Lexington and Concord, there was a series of mobilizations that were like against the Stamp Act and the different types of tea acts and things. The Boston Tea Party itself, a little property destruction there, but honestly, it was basically refusing to buy or purchase products from the crown. They were also refusing to export goods from the colonies back to the British. There was a huge system of economic cooperation that was set up to be autonomous from British economic control and colonial control. In fact, there was a lot of protests. I mean, do you remember the incident in Boston Common with Crispus Attucks, who was shot by British colonial authorities? That was a nonviolent demonstration that was taking place when Crispus Attucks was shot. And there was a lot of different contention in the colonies before the U.S. and the British actually fought. They fought, by the way, because the U.S. had convened an illegal constitutional convention and drafted a Declaration of Independence, which was a nonviolent action, right? They drafted a Declaration of Independence and said, we're essentially free. We have set up our own economic, judicial, and political systems. We're on our own, and we don't need the British colonial authorities. And that's what provoked, actually, the war, because the British came and tried to take it back. So in a way, like the way that we even tell ourselves our own stories about American history, and the fact that it was all kind of highly militarized, and all of our major political moments have been these militarized political moments, kind of obscures the level of kind of political resistance that has taken place all along. Of course, much more prominent examples and familiar and important examples include resistance by American Indians against various types of kind of Anglo-European repression and ultimately genocide. There's lots of different examples of kind of contemporary civil resistance, the civil rights movement, the abolition movement earlier, the feminist movement, ACT UP, the gay rights movement, and in this case, HIV and AIDS protection movement. And, you know, we have the Dreamers, who are, you know, some of the most skilled, perhaps, organizers in the country. We have the sanctuary movement. I mean, we have so many movements in this country that have had varying degrees of success that we can draw lessons from. So I think we have plenty here. And the research that we've done on other countries can apply, but I think we would just have total consistency in the findings.
Thank you so much. It's so inspiring to hear that, like, we have the tools, and looking in our own history, we can get some of the answers that we're looking for. I have, right before a bunch of people jumped on the call, you mentioned that you were working on a book, and maybe related to that, like, I have a question, which is, if there is one thing from your research or from other people's research on civil resistance that you would want every organizer or practitioner of strategic nonviolent action to know, like, what might that one thing be?
Right. Just one.
I mean, if you have more examples, you definitely can have more than one. But
okay. All right. Well, I think if I had to pick one, actually, it would be more about how long it takes for movements to win. Sometimes I get the sense that that organizing in the United States is so unbelievably taxing and exhausting that people have to sort of stay, like, there's a lot of kind of organizing campaigns or organizing kind of one tactic to the next, and it can be a very reactive kind of routine. And from looking at the cases that I've looked at and the data that I mentioned, the average campaign against a government, that is to overthrow a dictator, takes about 3 years to run its course. And the average campaign to achieve territorial independence is longer than that. And so, you know, one of the things I always wonder, or would ask organizers in the United States, is, you know, when you're looking at your situation, are you thinking about it in terms of a 5-year struggle, minimal 5-year struggle? And that is if everything goes right and the campaign, like, mobilizes a bunch of people at the beginning, and then that they stay mobilized for a few years. And part of the reason I think about that is just because if people started to think about movements as a strategy that actually informed which tactics they picked, instead of trying to pick tactics that can then push a strategy along, I wonder whether it might actually allow them to take more rest kind of in between tactics, because they know that it's building toward a larger strategy. But that's one thing. And then another thing I would want them to know is just that that method, you know, sticking to the same method over and over again is not necessarily shown to be a very effective technique, because it's, as I said, it becomes more of a brand than anything, and it can become easy for the opponent to maneuver around. And if it becomes kind of expected and normalized, then it loses a lot of its disruptive power. So I think we're at a point in the United States where, like, protest, some social movement scholars think that protest is so normalized as a method of contention that it, like, doesn't even count. I wouldn't go that far to say that. I think it counts a lot, especially if you have, like, I don't know, 6 million people doing it. That really counts, you know? But there is some truth to this idea that people become kind of either fatigued, or it becomes so routinized that it's not disruptive. And nonviolent resistance works when it disrupts, more so than when it just kind of symbolizes or lodges a complaint, basically.
Thank you so much.
I really resonate with that. One of the friends I work with, Kareen, often says that, you know, there's the 198 ways of of nonviolent action, and we use like 3 of them. So good agitation for all of us to think of other ways to take action. And actually, I'd like to.
Can I say something about that 198?
Yeah.
So the 198 methods of nonviolent action that people often refer to is a list that came from Gene Sharp's dissertation. And it's important to know that the only reason there are 198 is because his dissertation committee told him he had to stop counting and defend his thesis. It was already over 1,000 pages long. In fact, Oxford University created a policy where you could no longer write a thesis that long. Because but this is important, right? Because people think there's only 198, but actually it's a totally arbitrary cutoff. There's thousands of techniques, right? So that's just one thing to note about that list that I also hope people keep in mind.
That's incredible. I did not know that. I love that. That's incredible. And that's actually a good segue. I want to talk more about active popular support, what active participation looks like, and specifically the 3.5% rule. One of the standout conclusions from your work is that no campaign that achieved 3.5% active popular support within a country's population failed to achieve its goals. And we know this doesn't necessarily mean that actively mobilizing 3.5% of the population will guarantee any particular result. But particularly given the fact that many of us are organizing locally or organizing specific identity groups or groups of people, curious if like, how do you think the 3.5% rule might apply to a local context, like municipal or state, or even how it might apply to specific identity groups? So if you're organizing within like a community of young people, women, people of color. I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great questions, and super important. It has really important impacts on the way people try to recruit and organize. So the 3.5% rule is basically a discovery from the NAVCO data that shows that no campaign that surpassed that 3.5% threshold of national population size failed after doing so, as you said. But it's important to note that figure is drawn from peak participation rates from those data. And they cover that time period of 1900 to 2006. So for example, I haven't looked yet at every single case of civil resistance that emerged since 2006 to see whether the 3.5% threshold maintains. I think it does. As far as I can tell, just from looking over recent cases, but it's also the type of thing that now that people know about it, they use it to try to like go over the threshold of popular participation. And because of that, there's kind of a weird space-time quantum time warp around this, which is like, we don't know whether when people start to game the 3.5% rule, whether it will still have its power. Because part of what I think from the previous cases that we've analyzed is that when 3.5% of the population was actively mobilized and actively confronting the opponent, that probably meant that a huge majority of people were sympathetic, but only that small number of people was actively mobilized. So for example, if you try to say, okay, well, let's just get 3.5% of the United States population to do something and not care like what the popular perception is or what public opinion is, and you just say our benchmark is 11.5 million people engaged in civil resistance. I don't know. Like, I don't know if that would then bust the rule. So more will be revealed, I guess. But my sense is that in order to get that threshold of popular participation, you have to have a lot of supporters, like latent supporters who are not participating. And so that has implications for your question, because especially if it's organizing in and identity groups, especially if those identity groups are marginalized and oppressed already, then it really speaks to the necessity of thinking really beyond the 3.5% threshold. So like, what are the different potential sources of support in the society that can be drawn in to these groups? What coalitions and alliances are possible early on that can be organized and then sustained over the long haul? And I think that, for any organizer, the question isn't so much like, how can we like get past the threshold per se, although it's a very hopeful figure and it's doable and manageable for organizers, but more like, how can we actually go way beyond that and get like a ton of different actors involved in our coalition for the long haul. One thing I'll say about the findings on ethnic minorities. So like in the NAVCO data, we looked at territorial secession campaigns, for example, which are usually also campaigns where ethnic minorities in a society are trying to separate territorially from a majority ethnicity state. And so in those types of settings, it's actually much harder to win, whether you use nonviolent or violent resistance. And the general argument is because it can actually be much harder to get that broad-based participation without total intentionality from the outset that this is going to be part of the strategy, right? So the reason is because it's a small, like if you think about Tibet, for example, it's a tiny, tiny proportion of the population of China. It's really difficult to imagine that the Tibetan population, even if there was 100% participation in any kind of mass resistance, could affect enough disruption on the Chinese state to get what they wanted. So knowing this, the Tibetan liberation struggle has branched out and tried to form really robust international solidarity networks where they can actually, in a way, inflate through their alliances, their participation base. And so I think that this is the analogy in cases where you have, minority groups, identity groups, or whatever mobilizing, the more they can enhance their participation base by drawing in third-party supporters and other allies, the more likely they'll be to sort of overcome the sort of limits on their own participation potential.
Thank you so much. Okay, so just as a quick time check, it's 3:45. I want to make sure that folks on the call also get a chance to ask some of their questions. I have just a quick question before the Q&A I would love to ask you, Erica, which is, so the Momentum community cares a lot about experimentation, about learning, and like maybe you mentioned before, like I think we think of like our work as kind of a marathon. So in your mind, what are some of the biggest questions that we need to be asking kind of as practitioners and organizers that we should be exploring, and sort of like the kind of research that we should be doing kind of on the ground? Are there things like that you'd point us to?
Yeah, so the things that are really difficult from a movement perspective are, how do you get more and more people involved but become more and more united at the same time? So there's this paradox of needing a huge number of people with a very diverse coalition, but also needing to maintain unity in the context of a very diverse coalition. This is a tough one, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but there's not a ton of research on how you actually handle that as a practical matter. The second thing is related, which is, how do you get unity of methods and sort of kind of buy-in by people, especially people who don't have a ton of experience with activism, to be able to sort of do mass trainings, mass preparation work for the type of disciplined nonviolent action that's required to make real change. The third thing that I think is maybe the most untapped area of this entire field is the question of, what's the alternative that we're trying to envision? Gandhi called it constructive program. Some others call it parallel institution building. But the basic idea here is like, what is, if people are anti-capitalist, what's the alternative to it? What comes next? If people want to fight global inequality, what kind of system are they imagining that will do that will actually serve that purpose? What is the vision of racial justice that we can imagine and that we will live into creating in this country? So for me, a lot of it is articulating the alternatives, not just the method of contention, but what is the society we're trying to live in and that we're trying to produce? Because civil resistance can do a lot to disrupt and transform but it's not always clear what we're transforming into. And so the more that people can put their best efforts into thinking through those and coming up with these new solutions for social problems, I think the more effective the methods will be.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a big call to action. But thank you very much. Let me, at this point, hand things over to Lissy, who's going to run Q&A.
Great. This is just wonderful. Thank you so much, AFQ and Leo and Erica, for this. And thank you all for your brilliant questions. It's been great to see what you're thinking about throughout the interview. I wanted to, we won't have time for all of the questions, but I have recorded all of them, and I would love to think creatively about ways of answering those questions even after the interview. So fear not, your questions have not been forgotten. I wanted to start with a question that Steve Chase asked early on. Given the kind of broad dialogue around the impact of Antifa or Black Bloc protests on the kind of broader resistance movement that's been underway in the US, Steve's question was, what does research suggest about how low levels of violence, broadly defined, as Black Bloc or Antifa tactics, sometimes it's like property destruction, combined with mass civil resistance, is that less, more, or the same level of effectiveness compared to movements or campaigns that strictly maintain nonviolent discipline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there have been a few studies on this. Thanks for the question. So at different levels of analysis, for example, looking at the maximalist campaigns that I mentioned, there is evidence to suggest that low levels of violence make mass mobilization slightly less effective than if it is overwhelmingly nonviolent. There are other studies by people like Omar Wassow and Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughan, which I find incredibly convincing, that look at incident level effects. In other words, they, instead of looking at campaigns, they look at protest counts. And they look at whether a protest is violent or nonviolent, and then they and they count property destruction as violent in their cases. They're looking in democracies, and they've found that that the more violent protests there are, the more voters in those districts begin to vote for politicians with law and order platforms, as opposed to those that say civil rights, for example, is a more important issue. And so what you start to see is a real shift in third-party support, which translate in this case into vote behavior. And of course, that has a lot of consequences for the types of laws that are passed against protests and things like that. There's also Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughan's piece looks at the impacts of low levels of violence on labor concessions in France. And he finds that actually when they start using violence, it's much more likely that they get concessions. Again, because of the operation of this sympathy mechanism, people just don't think that the violence is justified. They think it's disproportionate, and they start to support no negotiation, basically, under those circumstances. Other studies, I have a paper that's coming out with Jonathan Pinkney and Orion Lewis, and we also find on an incident level basis that campaigns that use violence at a low level are much more likely to, or much less likely to get concessions from the opponent government. And they're also much more likely to elicit large-scale repression. So the issue is, of course, that the repression, when it happens, is not just against the people using the low levels of violence. It's against all of the demonstrators or people that are thought to support them. And so not only is it counterproductive, but it creates what I would call a moral hazard, which is to say your actions have negative impacts on people that didn't make the decision to do it. So I think that, the overwhelming kind of consensus among scholars who study this is that that low levels of violence undermine movement effectiveness. But of course, this is a very controversial and normative question as well. So there's still quite a lot of controversy about it.
Thanks, Erica. And appreciate your follow-up question around that, Johnson, and capturing that over here. I think we have time just to share one more question. And I wanted to offer one that Nicole Cardy shared in the chat box, which is referring to what you said about the important feature of movements being resilient in the face of repression or setbacks. Nicole's question was, what are some of the best practices that you've seen for creating resilient movements, and how do those practices scale? Are there good examples of doing that in very diverse countries?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So there's a great resource that some of you may know about. It's called the Handbook for Nonviolent Campaigns. It's put out by Training for Change. And in it, there are a series of I'd say more kind of practical answers to questions like this that's worth looking at. I think that I haven't seen anyway like a best practices guide with regard to this particular question, but I have seen I've talked to a lot of people around the world about this issue, and one of the things that comes out is, first of all, the need for good organization and really kind of stable, robust organization where there's a core group of committed people that meet, in some cases every single day, because that allows them to maintain trust. It protects against infiltration. It means that there's always some group taking responsibility for carrying things ahead, regardless of what happens. And it provides a really steady base of support and encouragement and momentum and initiative. In terms of ways to make a kind of a broader movement resilient, I've heard people say that in very repressive settings where there's like really routine arrests of core demonstrators and organizers, that just having a lot of prep around how to get people out of jail when they go is really important, because in many contexts, the worst abuses happen actually in detention. And so it's really important to get people out right away, like as soon as they're picked up and taken into jail or prison. So a lot of movements will have kind of mobile rapid response groups that will go to prisons or jails or detention centers where people have been taken. And they will engage in a series of techniques to try to get them out. There's, of course, the need for things like bail funds, strike funds, mutual aid funds, and the like for people that are going to have to kind of make more economic sacrifices than others in order to participate. There's sort of thinking about what kind of legal support is required to make sure that people get the best kind of representation they can. This is true even in very authoritarian settings, where even having sometimes a strong legal representative is enough for them to just let you go because they don't want to bother with it. There's also lots of experience around needing movements to have internal capacity for conflict and dispute resolution themselves, because they have conflicts. And so I think one of the main kind of opportunities for the conflict resolution field and the dispute resolution field is actually within movements, more so than between movements and their opponents. And then I think that there's a lot to be said just about like the sources of spiritual, emotional, psychological nourishment that are required to keep going. And this is part of why I think that historically speaking, so many movements have been rooted in, or at least largely supported by faith-based communities, because they're able to, they have capacity that others don't, and they're able to really provide support, nourishment, and direction, courage, different forms of sustenance to people that need support. So I think, again, to a certain degree, the Black church in the South during the civil rights movement provides a model of the ways that faith-based communities help to keep a movement active as it faced really intense and vicious repression from the segregationist state and different armed actors that wanted segregation to continue. And in that sense, I think there's a lot for us to learn today. I think the left in the United States has largely abdicated morality and religion to the right. And there's a great big opportunity to reclaim it and to reclaim the parts of faith-based communities that are totally consistent with the vision that that people on the progressive left or the radical left even are trying to imagine.
Cool. Thank you so much for those thoughts. I'm going to pass it back now to Alexandra.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica. Before we end things, wanted to ask you one last question. We're very excited about your research. It's informed the work of so many of us, and we're following it really closely. And we're just interested in hearing where your work is going next and anything that we can look forward to.
Maybe a small addendum is, are there other people whose research we should be following in addition to yours?
Yeah. Well, great questions. Lots of people are working in this field now. I would pay attention to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, just because they're a great kind of clearinghouse for a lot of different research that comes out. They call attention to a lot of new studies and things so that are relevant. In my own case, I'm working on a book right now called Civil Resistance: What Everyone Needs to Know. And it's basically like the 10 things that I want everyone to know about civil resistance. It's going to be an accessible book, trade paperback, real cheap, and hopefully helpful. And then I'm also actually working on an article right now with a colleague named Margarita Bellaggioso. And it's of interest to the Momentum community because a couple of years ago, I had a hunch that there was a way for movements actually to pay attention to how powerful they were becoming in the moment. And that we could actually use analogies from physics to try to help them evaluate this. Because force in physics is simply mass times participation or times acceleration. And so what I thought was, well, what if force for movements is mass, which is participation, times acceleration, which is like a closing together of how often they have some kind of contentious event. And so we've collected data. We've used data that's been collected on protest and different types of contentious actions in Africa from 1990 to 2012. And what we did is we created this kind of this variable where you can see the number of people participating times how fast or how quickly the events are moving together. And it turns out that it's like a dramatically influential factor in explaining success for these movements. And so there really are like physical properties to momentum. And that paper hopefully will come out. We're presenting it at a conference in a couple weeks, and then we'll revise it and hopefully it'll come out pretty soon. So that's something to keep in mind. I'll try to write it up so that it makes sense to people. And then the only other thing I'd mention is to pay attention to the crowd counting consortium. For those that are active in the United States, this is something that Jeremy Pressman, a professor at UConn, and I started doing back in January of 2017, where we basically count every protest or crowd that assembles for a political purpose in the United States every single day. And we post it in a live spreadsheet that's updated. You can go to crowdcounting.org and check out all the data. And we write a monthly column at the Washington Post, kind of giving a report about the state of the resistance in the United States, so to speak. So hopefully you can find that useful as you look to see where we are as a country, and certainly give us any feedback that you have about how it could be more helpful.